The Korean Peninsula has been a battleground of empires for centuries, with the 20th century being no exception. The peninsula endured Japanese occupation, followed by ideological division and a highly destructive war that shaped the nature of how the Cold War would be fought. In an earlier episode, we looked at the early history of South Korea, so we felt it only fair that North Korea received the same attention. I'm your host David, and today we are going to travel north of the DMZ to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and look at Kim Il-sung's elevation to power, the massive reforms of the 1950s, and the birth of a new ideology, Juche. This is the Cold War. Learning and expanding your knowledge is one of the best things you can do for yourself, so the sponsor of this video, Magellan TV, is a perfect place to start. Magellan TV's historical documentaries work as a fantastic complement to the Cold War's videos, and if you're interested in learning more about the history of North Korea, check out Kim Jong-un, the Unauthorized Biography. Investigators travel to Switzerland, the USA, and Asia to find out who really knows Kim and his eccentricities. Don't forget to check out other documentaries in Magellan TV's Current History section to explore fascinating topics from the 20th and even 21st centuries. And the good news is Magellan TV has much more than that. There are more than 3,000 documentaries waiting for you, and hundreds of them are on the history of various eras. We particularly love the travel documentaries on Magellan TV, as they are the perfect way to visit various countries in stunning 4K from the comfort of one's home. New documentaries are added weekly and available on most devices, including phones and PCs. Magellan TV has a kind and exclusive offer for our viewers. Click the link in the description to get a 1-month free trial and watch hundreds of history documentaries anytime, anywhere. On August 26, 1945, the Soviet 25th Army established its headquarters in the city of Pyongyang, tasked with the occupation of what would later become North Korea. Once there, they came across the local branch of the Committee for the Preparation of Korean Independence that had been set up in the brief time between the Japanese unconditional surrender and Soviet forces moving into the country. To the disappointment of the arriving Soviets, the Pyongyang Council was dominated by conservatives and was headed by the nationalist Cho Myeong Sik. He was a Presbyterian elder and an extremely popular figure because of his decades-long struggle against the Japanese. It was actually the Japanese who had approached him to lead a transitional government in order to avoid a power vacuum from forming and the chaos that would ensue from that. Now, despite the lack of ideological alignment between Cho and the Soviets, they had no real alternatives. Due to the lack of local communist leadership, the Soviets had no other options. They also figured that they could sway Myeong Sik enough to bring him closer to their policies. But it didn't take long for them to realize that Cho Myeong Sik was a staunch anti-communist, stemming from his religious and nationalist beliefs. As it was apparent that he wasn't going to change his views anytime soon, they began their search for a man that could lead a communist North Korea. Who they found was an ex-guerrilla fighter, a veteran who had fought the Japanese in Manchuria. In one of those interesting side notes of history, Kim Il-sung, like Cho Myeong Sik, came from a Protestant household. Now, it's not clear why Kim Il-sung was preferred by the Soviets over other prominent guerrilla leaders, but he had gained some notoriety from his achievements during his time fighting and was somewhat of a known entity by the Soviet officers in Korea who knew nothing about the local Korean communist leadership. So on October 14th, Il-sung was formally presented as the communist leader in the north, and from then on, he would gradually be groomed and promoted into various positions, such as the head of the North Korean Branch Bureau of the Communist Party of Korea in December. Cho Myeong Sik, meanwhile, remained in his position and even created his own political party, the Democratic Party of Korea, a decision that put him at odds with the Soviet authorities. The Soviets responded by using their influence to put Choi Yong-kun in the seat of the first deputy chairman of the party. Myeong Sik's time finally ran out on January 1st, 1946, when he refused to sign the joint US-Soviet trusteeship over Korea. 4 days later, he was arrested by Soviet soldiers, and the path towards the full communist takeover of North Korea lay open for Kim Il-sung. A month after Mansik's arrest, the USSR put forward its plan for the rapid communization of the northern state by creating the North Korean Provisional People's Committee, headed by, yes, you guessed it, Kim Il-sung. This committee would carry out a number of groundbreaking reforms, including the nationalization of any Japanese industry that remained in the country, the provision of universal primary education, the granting of equal rights to women, and a large-scale land reform project that was enacted in March of 1946. This last project was sweeping, affecting all land that was owned by Japanese nationals, land owned by people that were deemed national traitors, or land holdings larger than 5 chongbo, the equivalent of 12 acres. All of this land was confiscated and then redistributed to farming families. In addition, peasants were prohibited from selling, renting, or mortgaging this newly acquired land. On the 27th of December, it was also decided that these farmers would have to give 1/4 of their annual harvest as an agricultural tax. This sweeping reform paved the way for the later collectivization of agricultural land and was met with virtually no resistance, as there were not that many large landlords in the north, and besides, most of them had already fled to the south anyway. But it wasn't only landowners that fled from the north, but members of the bourgeoisie, merchants, intellectuals, students, and generally people who hated or feared the new regime. For the northern regime, this flight was actually a blessing, as it got rid of many destabilizing factors that could threaten their existence. Keep in mind when we say this that at the time, the South wasn't any type of a threat to the North. Okay, so that's the economic reform, but reforms weren't limited to just the economy. Throughout that year, major changes in the political scene north of the 38th parallel benefited the communists and Kim Il-sung. First, the North Korean branch bureau of the Korean Communist Party was rebranded as the North Korean Communist Party and then merged with the Sinmindang Party to form the Workers' Party of North Korea. This new party was a major force, holding 36% of the seats in the People's Assembly of North Korea and numbering around 366,000 members in 1946. Their membership then almost doubled by March 1948. Now, keep in mind that the North Korean Communist Party was not a homogeneous group, but rather one made up of various factions. During the First Party Congress in August 1946, Kim Tu-bong of the Yan'an, or Chinese faction, was elected chairman of the party, while Kim Il-sung of the guerrilla faction, Cho Myeong Sik of the domestic faction, and Ho Kai of the Soviet Koreans faction were elected vice chairman. These factions, as you can likely guess, reveal the political background of their members. The Soviet Koreans faction was made up of ethnic Koreans that had been born or raised in the USSR. The Yan'an faction was composed of Koreans that had been exiled to China and had then joined the Chinese Communist Party, while the domestic faction was comprised of Koreans that had never left the Korean peninsula. Finally, the guerrilla faction was made up of former Korean insurgents that had fought with the Japanese in Manchuria. With such diverse political and social backgrounds between all of the factions, it's little wonder that the party had many internal differences, which didn't take long to boil to the surface. In early 1947, a purge of the domestic faction was undertaken, with some 60,000 members expelled. The following year, even prominent members of the domestic faction, like Oh Ki-sop, were pushed to the sidelines by Kim Il-sung. 1948 was also the year of the formal division of the peninsula between a north and a south state. Following the UN-sponsored elections in the south, held in May, and then the proclamation of the Republic of Korea on the 15th of August, the Soviet authorities and the Korean communist leaders replied by proclaiming on the 9th of September the Democratic People's Republic of Korea with Kim Il-sung as premier. In the 2 years that followed, before the war, the DPRK consolidated its strength by taking advantage of the industrial base and especially the numerous hydroelectric dams the Japanese had built prior to the Second World War. They also leveraged the mineral-rich soil and the support of the people that they had won thanks to the land reform of 1946 and the fact that the North Korean leaders were proven patriotic fighters. With the support and guidance of Soviet experts, they implemented a Stalinist economy that was well suited for the quick mobilization of the people to prepare for the upcoming war. Now, we've done a fair bit on the war itself, so we aren't going to discuss that here. Instead, we're going to skip forward to 1953 and the armistice. By that time, North Korea found itself in somewhat worse shape than the South. They had suffered huge casualties, and American-led bombing had completely leveled cities and destroyed most industry and infrastructure. And yet, despite this, North Korea wasn't restarting from an entirely blank slate. Its political structure remained intact, along with its international support structures. The regime subsequently focused entirely on rebuilding what had been lost, and a tremendously successful 3-year plan had by 1957 restored industrial production to pre-war levels. It was succeeded by an equally successful 5-year plan that focused on expanding and improving existing industry, agriculture, and infrastructure. Following a Stalinist approach to development, similar to the Soviet plan from 1928 aimed at rapid industrialization, the North Korean regime completely centralized the economy, leaving nothing in the hands of private enterprises. Even food and clothing were provided through a public distribution system controlled by Pyongyang. Naturally, it wasn't just businesses and industries that were nationalized, but agriculture as well, taking aim at eliminating some of the problems that had been created by the land reform of 1946, as well as the war, including food and manpower shortages. Kim Il-sung pursued the Soviet model. He pressed for the total collectivization of the land. So in 1954, a broad and far-reaching collectivization movement was launched, and within a year, almost half of the peasants had been collectivized. 3 years later, the cooperative movement was initiated, with almost all farmers organized into collectives of 64 households. Gradually, these cooperatives were enlarged until in October of 1958, the system was reorganized. The number of collectives was reduced from 13,309 to 3,843, and each would consist of around 300 households with an average acreage of 500 chongbo. So within a decade of the initial land reforms that had granted land to the peasantry, many had gone back to being landless laborers, with tiny plots of land cultivated only for personal use being the only consolation Pyongyang allowed. The recovery of the North Korean economy was miraculous indeed, but we don't want to give anybody the wrong impression that they did it alone. They didn't. They received help from their communist allies. The Soviet Union supplied ample amounts of resources, as well as technical expertise, contributing to the repairing of the Supung hydroelectric dam, itself originally built by the Japanese, and the largest dam in Asia at the time. Also rebuilt using Soviet resources and expertise was the port of Nampo. The Chinese also provided material the North Korean regime lacked, all at subsidized prices. They also assisted in the reconstruction effort by providing labor by means of PLA troops that remained in the country following the war, not being withdrawn until 1958. The need for a large labor force was a major challenge for the People's Republic, and one of the primary reasons that contributed to the entry of women to the workforce. As you can expect, this in turn stimulated major social changes. All of these changes also gave birth to a new movement. Since the state needed more production of basically everything, workers had to work more efficiently, and what better way to motivate them than through the personal guidance of the great leader himself? The Chulima Movement, named after the mythological Chinese horse, was launched in December of 1956 when Kim Il-sung addressed the nation. Let us produce more, practice economy, and overfulfill the 5-year plan ahead of schedule. Inspired by the earlier Soviet Stakhanovite campaigns, the Chulima Movement aimed to organize and inspire the workers through various propaganda tools, like slogans and the awarding of medals, to encourage them to work long hours and produce more than just their quota. One of the methods that was used to increase the efficiency of workers, and one you are already likely familiar with, was the field inspection. This was where Kim Il-sung personally visited farmers and workers to inspire them and provide some of his wisdom to them. For the time period we're looking at in the 1950s, the Chulima appears to have been quite effective, although from 1961 onwards, economic output did begin to fall. One of the obvious reasons for this is that it is impossible to overwork people indefinitely. Another factor in the production drop was the inevitable result of putting all investment into the development of industry, while other sectors were ignored. For regular watchers of the channel, you will already know that Stalin's death marked a major shift in policy in the Soviet Union and many of the satellite states. This, however, didn't apply to North Korea. Kim Il-sung was determined to develop more heavy industry to support a larger military in case the war rekindled and to achieve the economic autonomy of his state. This economic autonomy was in line with Kim Il-sung's new ideology, Juche. Introduced in his speech in 1955, Juche became the official state ideology. Juche emphasizes self-reliance at all levels: economic, diplomatic, military, and even ideological. It differs in many ways from traditional Marxism-Leninism, as it also incorporates nationalistic elements. This is why critics have called it an ultra-nationalist ideology, but keep in mind it also has some similarities to a religion, as it is deeply connected to Kim Il-sung's cult of personality, which had started as early as 1949. Kim Jong-il would later explain Juche as Marxism-Leninism, but adapted for the North Korean reality. On the diplomatic level, Juche meant that North Korea would strive to not become a satellite state of either the Soviet Union or China. To accomplish this, Pyongyang was careful not to become too reliant on help from either power and instead played both depending on the situation. North Korea also made sure not to take a side in the Sino-Soviet split, though it did reject Destalinization. Now, speaking of Destalinization, that process in the Soviet Union actually helped Kim Il-sung to consolidate his power and remove his remaining political opponents. He'd already eliminated the domestic communists as soon as the war had ended. He'd ousted Ho Kai-yi, the leader of the Soviet Koreans faction, back in 1951 over differences regarding the party's structure and the latter's indiscriminate purges against low-ranking members. Yet, there were still some 200 Soviet Koreans and a number of officials belonging to the Yan'an group that occupied important positions within the regime. That was until 1956, when they made what turned out to be a fateful mistake. Emboldened by Khrushchev's criticism and denunciation of Stalin, some members of both the Soviet Korean and the Yan'an factions, with Pak Chang-ok as their leader, dared to criticize Kim Il-sung's cult of personality and economic policies. You can imagine what happened next. Despite Soviet and Chinese interventions to protect them, Kim Il-sung by 1957 had managed to eradicate the two opposing factions, arresting some, but allowing most of them to leave the country into permanent exile. Within the next 4 years, most of North Korean leadership had been replaced, with only Kim's loyal ex-guerrillas remaining in their positions. With no opposition left, the party and the state of North Korea became Kim Il-sung's personal instruments, and he would soon tie both to his family by grooming his son, Kim Jong-il, as his successor. With Kim Il-sung firmly ensconced as the great leader, North Korea's trajectory during the Cold War was like that of the rebellious child. Still part of the communist family, but very much marching to the beat of its own drum. With the attempt at self-sufficiency came fewer strings of control from either Moscow or Beijing, and the independent actions of that rebellious child proved a wild card for the United States and its Western allies to deal with. From seemingly random attacks on US shipping and aircraft to troops along the DMZ, the Korean border remained, and potentially still remains, a flashpoint threatening to throw the world back into bloody conflict. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and to make sure you don't miss all of our future episodes, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have purged any and all rival bell button supporters so that there remains only supporters of the one true and eternal great bell button. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of our patrons, since without your help, none of this would be possible week after week. If you aren't a patron, consider supporting us at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com, and we're active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. This is The Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, I will leave you with the words of JFK. In the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal.